The uncomfortable truth. You don't accidentally fall into a toxic relationship. You recognize it. Not consciously, not logically, but your body does. The tension, the unpredictability, the emotional highs followed by silence. It feels intense, magnetic, almost fated. And here's the destabilizing truth. The very thing that hurts you often feels like chemistry. You call it passion, you call it connection, you call it love. But your nervous system calls it familiar. And familiarity is powerful. Because what feels familiar feels safe, even when it isn't. That's why you stay longer than you planned. That's why leaving feels like withdrawal. That's why the red flags look like challenges instead of warnings. This isn't weakness, it's wiring. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. But first, you have to recognize yourself in the pattern. And that part might sting, because this is the part no one explains. The mirror you avoid. You tell yourself, it wasn't always like this. You remember the beginning, the intensity, the way they looked at you like you were rare. You felt chosen. But soon, you were anxious, checking your phone, replaying conversations, adjusting yourself to keep the peace. This is where emotional attachment quietly shifts into emotional dependency. You don't just want them, you need reassurance from them. You don't just love them, you fear losing them. That fear becomes louder than your intuition. And here's the part most people miss. It's not love, it's familiarity. If you grew up chasing approval, you'll chase it in romance. If affection felt inconsistent, consistency might feel boring. So your system doesn't look for healthy, it looks for known. And known often looks like chaos dressed as passion. And that chaos, it feels like home. But why does intensity feel safer than peace? When adrenaline masquerades as love, your body doesn't distinguish well between excitement and anxiety, a racing heart, sweaty palms, hyperfocus. It can be attraction, or it can be a nervous system response. In a trauma bond, emotional highs are followed by emotional drops. Your brain releases stress hormones, then relief, then stress again. That cycle creates chemistry, not healthy bonding, but chemical attachment. Intermittent affection is powerful. It keeps you hooked. Because the brain doesn't chase stability, it chases reward. And unpredictable reward is the most addictive kind. So when someone pulls away, your system doesn't relax, it activates. Fight, flight, freeze, fawn. You call it trying harder. Your body calls it survival. This is why you confuse intensity with depth. Your nervous system learned long ago, love requires alertness, and calm feels unfamiliar. But where did that lesson begin? Childhood wounds don't expire. You weren't born fearing abandonment. You learned it. Maybe love was conditional. Maybe emotions were dismissed. Maybe you had to perform to feel valued. So you developed strategies. Be perfect, be needed, be quiet, be strong. These survival identities work in childhood, but in adulthood, they distort intimacy. Now you overgive, overexplain, overstay, because your abandonment wound whispers, if you're not enough, they'll leave. Or worse, if you're too much, they'll leave. So you shrink, or you overfunction. That's insecure attachment in action, not as a diagnosis, but as a pattern. You don't attach to people, you attach to the possibility of finally feeling chosen. And when they trigger old pain, you don't see danger. You see a chance to repair the past. But that repair never comes, because you're not fighting for love, you're fighting for identity. And this changes everything. The mid-video shift. You don't stay because you're weak. You stay because your nervous system thinks this is home. Read that again. The chaos feels familiar. The distance feels normal. The emotional roller coaster feels alive. Calm feels suspicious. When someone stable shows up, you might feel bored. Not because they lack depth, but because your body isn't activated. This is the micro-revelation most people never reach. Your body bonded to unpredictability. That's a trauma bond. And breaking it doesn't start with cutting someone off. It starts with understanding why you're attached. Without shame, without denial, because shame keeps you stuck. Awareness sets you free. But awareness also demands responsibility, and that's where it gets uncomfortable. Patterns over people. It's easy to blame the other person, and yes, toxic behavior is real. But if the pattern repeats, the common denominator deserves compassion, not condemnation. Self-awareness asks harder questions. Why do I feel drawn to emotionally unavailable people? Why does intensity feel like proof? Why do I panic at distance but resist closeness? Emotional patterns don't form randomly. They form around unmet needs. If you didn't feel consistently seen, you may chase visibility. If you felt abandoned emotionally, you may cling to connection. This isn't about self-blame. It's about self-responsibility. Because until you see the pattern, you'll call it fate. And it's not fate. It's familiarity repeating itself. But patterns can be interrupted if you're willing to look deeper. The fear beneath the attachment. Under every toxic relationship, there's usually one dominant fear: being left, being unseen, being unworthy. That fear fuels emotional dependency. You tolerate what hurts because losing them feels worse. Your identity slowly distorts. You become who you think they need. That's identity distortion. And spiritually, it runs deeper. When your worth is tied to human validation, you forget who you are beyond someone's approval. Not in a preachy way, in a quiet, internal erosion. You forget your inherent value. You forget that love isn't earned through suffering. You forget that peace is allowed. And when you forget who you are, you'll attach to anyone who temporarily defines you. But rediscovering identity changes the attachment itself. And that's where healing begins. Healing doesn't start with leaving. It starts with regulating your nervous system, learning to sit with calm, learning that silence isn't rejection, learning that stability isn't danger. You begin noticing triggers without reacting. That's growth. You pause before texting. You observe the urge to chase. You question the story in your head. Slowly, emotional attachment becomes conscious instead of compulsive. You realize you weren't addicted to them. You were attached to the feeling of being needed. You weren't in love with chaos. You were trying to outrun old wounds. And with each layer of awareness, the pattern weakens. Not overnight, but gradually. And something unexpected happens. You stop craving intensity. You start craving peace. And peace no longer feels empty. It feels powerful, which leads to one final truth. The withdrawal no one talks about. Leaving a toxic relationship doesn't always feel empowering. Sometimes it feels like panic, like your chest is collapsing inward, like silence is screaming, like you made a mistake. This is the part no one explains. When you step away from a trauma bond, your body can react as if it's losing something essential. Not because the relationship was healthy, but because it was chemically familiar. Your nervous system got used to the cycle. Tension, conflict, reconnection, relief. That relief wasn't peace. It was the drop after adrenaline, and your brain learned to crave that drop. So when you remove the person, you don't just lose them. You lose the chemical rhythm your body adapted to. That's why you want to text them just to check. That's why you romanticize the good moments. That's why your mind edits out the pain. It's not stupidity. It's a conditioned emotional pattern. Emotional attachment doesn't disappear just because logic wakes up. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes you miss the intensity more than you miss the person, because intensity made you feel alive, chosen, activated. Calm feels empty in comparison, but emptiness is often just your system recalibrating. This is the space where healing either begins or where the cycle restarts. And what you do in this space defines the next chapter. The silence that feels like danger. After the chaos fades, something unfamiliar appears. Silence. No dramatic arguments, no emotional spikes, no desperate need to fix something. Just space. And strangely, that space can feel threatening. Because when your nervous system has been conditioned by unpredictability, calm doesn't register as safety. It registers as absence. You start questioning everything. Why don't I feel butterflies? Why does this feel flat? Is something missing? But what's missing isn't love, it's activation. Your body became used to heightened emotional states, the rush of uncertainty, the relief of reconciliation, the constant scanning for signs of rejection. Without that stimulation, your system feels underengaged. So you may unconsciously create drama, overanalyze neutral behavior, interpret delayed replies as emotional withdrawal. Not because the new connection is unsafe, but because your system is searching for the emotional patterns it recognizes. This is where many people sabotage healthy relationships. They mistake stability for lack of passion. They equate peace with boredom. But peace is not boredom. Peace is what love feels like when survival is no longer running the show. And if that feels unfamiliar, it doesn't mean it's wrong. It means your body is learning something new. The question is, can you tolerate calm long enough for it to feel like home? The identity beneath the attachment. At some point, the question stops being, why do I keep choosing toxic relationships? And becomes, who am I when I'm not trying to be chosen? That's where it gets real. Because for many people, emotional attachment wasn't just about love, it was about identity. If you grew up feeling invisible, you may have built an identity around being indispensable. If you felt abandoned, you may have built one around never giving up on anyone. If you felt too much, you may have learned to shrink and call it maturity. These aren't flaws, they're adaptations. But when survival identities follow you into adulthood, they quietly shape your relationships. You don't just fall in love, you audition. You don't just connect, you prove. You don't just stay, you endure. And endurance feels noble, loyal, strong, spiritual even. But sometimes endurance is just fear wearing dignity as a disguise. This is the part most people resist seeing. Because if you're not the rescuer, if you're not the fixer, if you're not the one who stays no matter what, who are you? That question can feel destabilizing. Yet, it's also liberating. Because once you separate your worth from someone else's ability to choose you, something shifts. You realize your value was never dependent on being needed, it was inherent. And when identity stops being built around survival, your emotional patterns begin to loosen their grip. But awareness alone isn't enough. The next step requires courage most people avoid. Not dramatic courage, quiet courage, the kind that changes everything from the inside out. The quiet courage of interrupting the pattern. Real change doesn't start with a dramatic goodbye. It starts in a small, almost invisible moment. The moment you feel the urge to chase, and you don't. The moment anxiety rises in your chest, and instead of reacting, you breathe. That is quiet courage. Because when you've lived inside emotional patterns shaped by insecure attachment, your impulses feel urgent. Text now, fix this, explain more, don't let them drift. Your nervous system response wants resolution immediately. But healing asks for something different. Pause, not suppression, not denial. Pause. In that pause, you begin separating past from present. You ask yourself, Is this situation truly unsafe? Or is it touching an old abandonment wound? That question alone interrupts the trauma bond. For the first time, you respond instead of react, and it feels uncomfortable. Your body may protest, your thoughts may spiral. You may feel exposed without the usual strategies: no over-explaining, no over-giving, no over-functioning. But this discomfort is not danger, it's rewiring. This is how emotional dependency slowly transforms into self-trust. You begin meeting your own needs before demanding someone else meet them. You soothe yourself before seeking external reassurance. You validate your own emotions instead of outsourcing that responsibility. And something subtle shifts. You stop asking, "Will they stay?" and start asking, "Do I feel safe here?" That question is power. Because now the focus isn't on being chosen, it's on choosing consciously. And once you experience that shift, you can't go back to unconscious attachment. But there's still one layer left. The layer that determines whether this becomes temporary insight or a true healing journey. When you stop calling chaos chemistry, there comes a moment in the healing journey that feels almost anticlimactic. No fireworks, no dramatic closure, no grand confrontation, just clarity. You're sitting across from someone, maybe the same type you used to fall for, and instead of feeling consumed, you feel observant. You notice the inconsistency, the subtle emotional unavailability, the familiar push-pull dynamic. And for the first time, your body doesn't interpret it as chemistry. It interprets it as information. That's growth. Because what once triggered pursuit now triggers awareness. You feel the flicker of attraction, but you also feel the cost. The late-night anxiety, the mental rehearsals, the emotional highs followed by doubt. And suddenly, intensity doesn't feel romantic. It feels expensive. This is where self-awareness becomes embodied. You're no longer trying to fix someone to fix your childhood wounds. You're no longer confusing emotional attachment with destiny. You see the pattern forming in real time. And here's the subtle but powerful shift. You don't need to prove you can handle it. You don't need to demonstrate loyalty through suffering. You don't need to earn love by tolerating instability. Because you finally understand something most people never pause long enough to see. Chemistry without safety is not connection, it's activation. And activation is not the same as intimacy. When that distinction becomes clear, your standards change quietly. Not from arrogance, from alignment. You start choosing based on how you feel after interactions, not during the emotional spike. Do you feel grounded, respected, seen without performing? Or do you feel slightly anxious, slightly unsure, slightly smaller? That awareness becomes your compass. And once your compass recalibrates, the old pool weakens. But there's still one final transformation. Not about them, about you. About who you become when love no longer feels like survival. When love stops feeling like survival. There is a version of you who no longer scans the room for emotional danger. A version who doesn't measure love by intensity. A version who doesn't confuse longing with connection. But meeting that version requires grieving something first. You have to grieve the fantasy. The fantasy that if you loved harder, stayed longer, proved deeper loyalty, the other person would finally choose you in the way you always wanted to be chosen. That fantasy is powerful because it's not just about them. It's about rewriting childhood wounds, healing the abandonment wound through endurance, turning emotional dependency into a victory story. But love is not a battlefield where you earn safety. It's a space where safety already exists. And when you begin to internalize that, something radical happens. You stop trying to win people. You start discerning them. You no longer ask, how do I keep this? You ask, is this aligned with who I'm becoming? That question changes your nervous system response because now your body isn't bracing for impact. It isn't preparing for fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. It's evaluating, calmly. You begin to feel the difference between anxiety and intuition. Anxiety rushes. Intuition is steady. Anxiety says, don't lose this. Intuition says, pay attention. And when intuition becomes louder than fear, insecure attachment begins to loosen its grip. Not because you forced yourself to detach, but because you outgrew the pattern. You realize a toxic relationship was never proof of your depth. It was a reflection of unhealed identity distortion. And now, you are no longer trying to survive love. You are learning to experience it without disappearing inside it. There is only one final step left, not external, internal, the decision that defines the rest of your relationships.
The transformational close. You are not broken. You adapted. You survived environments that taught your nervous system to stay alert. But survival is not the same as intimacy. A healthy relationship will not feel like fireworks every day. It will feel steady, grounded, safe. And at first, that might feel unfamiliar. But unfamiliar doesn't mean wrong. It means new. Your healing journey isn't about blaming the past. It's about choosing differently with awareness. You can unlearn emotional patterns. You can heal insecure attachment. You can experience connection without fear. Not because you found the perfect person, but because you became conscious of your wiring. Your nervous system learned survival. Now it can learn safety. And once you see the pattern, you don't just ask, why do I stay? You begin asking, what kind of love reflects who I'm becoming? And that question changes everything.